And it's Josh and I's kids oftentimes that are the loudest ones, making all the screaming in the background. Oh, yeah. So welcome this week. I'm Pastor Michael. We are actually kicking off this morning a brand new sermon series. It's 4 weeks, and we're looking through the book of Esther. And I know for some in this room, I've had conversations. This is your favorite book. Esther's maybe your favorite character in the Bible. This is a very special book, right? In fact, as we'll see today, this book is sort of one of a kind. There is no book in the Bible quite like Esther. It's unique from all the others. And to start getting you thinking about what makes this book of Esther so unique and one of a kind, I just want you to start imagining with me the setting, the context of this book. The context of this book is that God's people, right, have been captured in an exile. They've been away from their homeland for about 70 years. They've been exiled in Babylon. And then there comes about a big change in power, right? A big shift in geopolitical empires. The Mesopotamian empires rise up and conquer the Babylonians, who had conquered the Israelites. And first it was the Medes, and then it was the Persians rise up to power. But with these changes in power that are going on, there comes political changes. And the government is sort of in transition through these periods. And the Jews, during all this, they're allowed to go back from exile to Jerusalem. They get to go back from their captivity back to Jerusalem. So books like Ezra in the Bible would describe the first pilgrimages that are coming back from this area of Babylon back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And the setting of the book of Esther is sort of between the pilgrimages of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, we kind of have a historical setting for the book of Esther. And the Hebrew people who are not returning to Jerusalem, right, the people who decided not to go with Ezra, not all of them went back. Some of the Hebrews stayed in this area. And that is where the story of Esther takes place. These are those Jews, right, who didn't return to Jerusalem. They stayed and lived in this foreign pagan culture. And here's what makes Esther somewhat special. Okay, this book is somewhat special because the book of Esther is about God's people, right, who are living in the midst of a pagan culture. And as we'll see in this book, they are actually targeted. The Jews in this book are actually targeted by their pagan culture for annihilation. But here's what's odd about the book of Esther and all of this. God will never, ever be mentioned in the book of Esther. Esther is the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned. God's name is completely absent from this entire book. See, the book of Esther is trying to get you to ask a question, right? The book is begging you to ask a question. And that question is, God, where are you? God, there's bad stuff happening around me, right? Where'd you go? And maybe you've felt that way before. Possibly you've asked that exact question. God, where are you right now? Well, Esther is the book of the Bible that was written with that specific question in mind. Now, this morning, we're going to be focusing in on Esther chapters 1 and 2. You can start turning there if you want to. Find it in your Bibles. Esther's chapter 1 and 2. And we'll start this morning just with a quick overview of the events of chapter 1. Okay, we're not going to read through all of chapter 1. We're going to overview the events, and then we're going to read through a big hunk of chapter 2. And so our basic game plan this morning starts with us getting familiar with the text of Esther chapters Esther chapters 1 and 2. Fairly straightforward starting point, right? And then we'll go on this morning from there, right, to see that there's a lot of modern misunderstandings about this book of Esther. In fact, we're going to start by just looking at and specifically focusing on what the book of Esther is not, right? This is what the book of Esther is not, ... Because we need to remove some of those predetermined conclusions that we have about this book. For some this morning, I'm going to be honest, right? I'm going to ruin the book of Esther for you. Because maybe those things you loved about this book were those predetermined conclusions that we have as we read it that aren't actually the book of Esther. So just a warning, if your favorite character in the Bible is Esther, you might want to pause and stop listening, right? Beware, your world is about to be turned upside down. So after clearing out, right? So we're going to read through these two chapters. We're going to figure out what these two chapters say. And after clearing out some predetermined conclusions that we might have as we approach this book, right? We're going to figure out what Esther is not. And then from there, we'll be ready to see with fresh eyes what the book of Esther actually is. So again, we're going to get familiar with this text, and then I'll ruin the book for you, and we'll learn what the book is not, ultimately with the goal that we'd actually appreciate what the book of Esther is. So let's set off on this journey. We're going to get familiar with the text of Esther chapters 1 and 2. And here's a basic quick overview of Esther chapter 1, right? I hope this week you go back and read through it. Chapter 1's pretty interesting. Basically, we're introduced to this Persian king called Xerxes, right? And this is the same Persian Xerxes, right, who 3 years after the story of Esther, so 3 years later after this story, he will end up fighting the Greeks, right? And that fight becomes the inspiration for Hollywood movies like 300, right? The Spartans, right? This is the same Xerxes from that movie, who goes to war twice with the Greeks and loses. So King Xerxes, right, in this book of Esther, all through chapter 1, right, Xerxes is boasting about his own glory and his own power that he has, right? He throws a party and basically invites everyone who's anyone. He invites everyone who's important to this party. And at this party, he has unlimited wine, right? And everyone drinks from their own artisan, handcrafted golden goblet, right? In this party, it lasts 6 months. See, Xerxes, what he's doing is he's showing off his empire. He's showing all of his friends. It's a demonstration of his power, right? All the wealth that he has. And King Xerxes, he feels like he's king of the world, right? And he wants everyone to know about it. So hence this giant party. And towards the end of this huge party, right, King Xerxes is drunk, right? And he wants to show off his wife to all of his friends, just like a trophy. Okay, which, granted, this would be insulting for her. But nevertheless, Xerxes summons Queen Vashti, his queen, right? So he can parade her around. And Queen Vashti says no, right? She refuses to enter his royal courtroom. And this is terribly embarrassing for Xerxes, right? He's standing in front of all of his friends. And he's boasting about how great and powerful he is. And Queen Vashti sort of ruins their 6-month drunken party. So Xerxes, in a fit of drunken rage, right, he banishes Queen Vashti from his presence. You know, if she won't come in here and see me, she'll never come in here and see me, right? Like King Xerxes. And unfortunately, when a Persian king makes an edict, right? It cannot be undone. Because the Persian kings are supposed to be perfect, right? In this Persian culture, these kings are supposed to be thought of as like deities, right? They're perfect. They wouldn't make a mistake. Hence, Persian kings could never be wrong. And therefore, the edicts of these Persian kings cannot be undone. And it's basically after King Xerxes sobers up, right, from his essentially 6-month bender, right, and that we enter into chapter 2 of Esther, and we hear what unfolds. So let's read Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 18. And I'll be reading from the New International Version this morning. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Verse 5, now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and placed under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her nationality and background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Verse 12. Before a young woman's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Even in the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shagi, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abilhai, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all of his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberty. So there's a little bit more to the end of this chapter. There's one more event that happens at the end of chapter 2. Basically, Mordecai, with the assistance of Esther, they're able to prevent an assassination attempt of King Xerxes. They save his life. Now, just after reading chapter 2, there's a lot there, a lot that unfolded, but we already know enough about this book to know what the book of Esther is not. We know enough already to know what this book is not, right? We know enough already to start correcting some of the common misconceptions about this book. So if this is your favorite book of the Bible, let me now proceed to ruin the book of Esther for you. And in order that, right, we're looking deeper at this, in order that we can eventually acknowledge and appreciate what the book of Esther actually is. So what the book of Esther is not. There's two things I want to point out for you that the book of Esther is not. The first thing is the book of Esther is not a guide on morality. It's not a guide on morality. Hopefully that's becoming pretty apparent, right? Much of what happens in this book is either morally questionable or just outright wrong. People are drunk for like half this book. Seems like every scene that Xerxes is in, he's drinking, right? And the book of Esther has tons of partying, and this is a pagan culture that is talking about, right? This is like one big, massive, immoral carnival. There's gluttony, debauchery, the whole 9 yards, right? This book has a lot of vanity and pride. Seems like it's everywhere, right? And it's not just King Xerxes who's got like this vanity, this pride, right? This book is full of moments where under your breath, you'll say something along the lines of, wow, that was a bit arrogant, right? Why wasn't so-and-so just like that much more humble, right? This book is filled with deception and lies. The bad guys collude and scheme, right? And they mislead with deception. But even our great heroine, Esther, right? She intentionally misleads everyone about her identity. And in fact, no one seems to like find her out, right? And that means, right, connotation, that means that Esther is good at deceiving people. I mean, honestly, right? Apparently she must be a good liar, right? Just saying. So point 1, the book of Esther is not a guide on morality. The book of Esther is not saying this is how you should live. Here's the second point. The book of Esther is not a guide to wise cultural engagement. This is not a guide to wise cultural engagement. See, I need to correct something, and I'm not sure where this came from, but it seems to be pretty popular. There are quite a few popular Bible studies and teachers on the book of Esther where they basically say, we need to be like Esther, right? She's a role model for ladies, right? Esther, yeah. Be a modern day Esther in your community, right? Well, no, not exactly. Recognize that Esther, she capitulates to the pagan culture. I mean, she basically largely surrenders to the pagan culture around her. Throw the verse up there. I want to point it to your attention. Esther 2:10. It says, Esther did not reveal her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbid her to do so. See, Esther, she capitulates and pretends not to be Jewish, right, in front of everyone. And so as you're thinking about how do we engage the culture around us, well, if we think to the New Testament, Matthew 5:15, remember when Jesus, he says those famous words, you are the light of the world, right? You are the light of the world. And then, therefore, hide your light under a basket, right? so that no one finds out. Wait, what? Did Jesus say that? I don't remember that part. No, that wasn't part of that paragraph, right? Or some people here, you might remember, I remember I had this song growing up. For those who had the kids' Sunday school songs that you would sing, one of the old ones that was out there, maybe you remember it, you can kind of follow along. This little light of mine, right? I'm going to let it shine, right? And then remember there's part of that song that says, hide it under a basket. No. Oh, wait, Esther says yes, right? That's what's happening. Esther is not a book on wise cultural engagement. Because emulating Esther, being like Esther in that context, would mean that you're hiding that you're Jewish or Christian. You're pretending not to be. Emulating Esther means you hide your light under a basket. And just think about it. For Esther to live at the palace, this harem, right, for a whole year, and for no one to ever recognize that she was Jewish, recognize with me what that means, what that would connotate, right? Esther probably did not honor Jewish kosher food laws, right? They would have picked up on something like that. Esther probably did not honor the Sabbath, right? That would have been way too obvious that she was Jewish. Esther probably did not have her Hebrew Bible with her, walking around. See, once we start looking honestly at Esther, it makes way more sense why later in this book, characters will be utterly shocked to find out that Esther is actually Jewish? What? No way. Esther, you don't act Jewish at all, right? Now pause with me. We need to come to grips with the fact that Esther largely capitulates, right? She surrenders to her pagan culture and the influences around her. This book is not supposed to be a guide on wise cultural engagement. If you're looking for something like that, a better resource would be like the book of Daniel, right? Daniel doesn't hide his faith. Daniel doesn't capitulate, right? He pushes back and maintains his Jewishness. Daniel even finds a way to maintain kosher laws while he's in captivity. Daniel pulls culture to become more Jewish, right? There's this name that's given to Daniel, Belteshazzar. It's a Babylonian name. It's actually the name of a Babylonian deity, and it never quite sticks. You know, Daniel is winsome. He turns the heart of Nebuchadnezzar to the Lord. So as you compare these two different books, these two different heroes, right? Daniel is the character who pulls culture to become more Jewish. Esther is the character who is pushed by culture to become less Jewish. Some of you listening right now are struggling, right? Michael, are you telling me that Esther is not a guide on wise moral and cultural engagement, right? But I always told my daughter to be like Esther, right? My world is turning upside down. I have one last observation for you, okay? And this is sort of going to be the final nail in the coffin, as it were. You will not be able to unhear this next part. So seatbelts, everyone. This will ruin your preconceived notions about the book of Esther. Here's the observation. Recognize with me that Esther, that name, that's not even originally a Jewish name. Esther is a pagan name. Hadassah, right, is her actual Jewish name, right? Esther is more than likely her Babylonian name. And Esther is actually based on this word Ishtar, right? And Ishtar is actually the name of a Babylonian deity. In fact, Ishtar is the exact same Babylonian deity that later gets rebranded by the Roman Empire as the goddess Venus. So Esther is named after a pagan god. See, remember when Babylon, this pagan culture, it tried to rename Daniel, right, to Belteshazzar. That name never stuck. Daniel pulls culture to become more Jewish. He retains his Hebrew name. The book is named Daniel, not Belteshazzar. In comparing Esther and Daniel, their names themselves demonstrate a difference between these two books, right? The intentions of these two books are different. Even our other hero of the story of Esther, right? Mordecai. Does that sound like a good Jewish name? It shouldn't, right? Mordecai is yet another totally Babylonian name. His name's derived after the god Marduk, the chief god of the city of Babylon. Mordecai. And worse yet, you never even learned Mordecai's Hebrew name, right? The book of Esther is not a guide to wise cultural engagement or morality. That's not the point of this book. Yes, Esther at her core, right? Yes, she identifies with her Jewish heritage. But her diet appears pagan. Her actions are pretty pagan. Her name is pagan. When Esther marries King Xerxes, that's actually a direct violation of the Jewish law as well, right? Like the whole premise of this book is one where Esther is not a guide to this is wise engagement or this is what you should emulate if you want to be moral, right? Esther is basically one of the least Jewish people in the entire Bible who's still Jewish. And that's a feature of this story. That is an intentional element of this story. And it's almost like the author of this story has to reveal to you that Esther even is Jewish, right? And then say, no, really, Esther really is Jewish, I promise. Like, here's a genealogy, right? So now the book of Esther has maybe been ruined for some of you. And now that we sort of have cleaned the slate, right? Some of those preconceived notions have kind of been thrown out the window. We're starting from scratch. Let's discover together now what the book of Esther actually is. We'll discover the meaning of this book in part from what's missing from this book. The book of Esther never mentions God. It never mentions the temple. It never mentions prayer. It never mentions any distinctive Jewish practice like the Sabbath. See, the book of Esther is the most secular book, the most non-Jewish book of the entire Bible. There is this massive void in this book when it comes to any sort of reference to God. And that is intentional. Because Esther is written to those who feel like there's a big void in their life when it comes to God's presence. Esther is written to those who feel like their world is upside down and who are asking that question, where is God in the midst of all this? God, it feels like you are MIA, missing in action. Just like the book of Esther. Esther is a very special book for those who are asking and struggling with that feeling. Because the book of Esther is a story of deliverance. This is a story of deliverance. The story of Esther is actually more comparable in some ways to the book of Exodus, to the Exodus deliverance, right? Almost think of Exodus when you think of Esther. Remember in Exodus, the Jews are in slavery in Egypt, and that story, it sort of culminates around this Passover event, right? And what ends up happening is that Passover event becomes a feast to remember, right? To remember forever the wonders and miracles that God did. The events like Moses parting the Red Sea. Passover, remember. Exodus is a story of deliverance, and Esther is also a story of deliverance. And the story of Esther also culminates with a special feast. This feast to remember forever their deliverance. And that feast is called Purim. But the story of Esther, it involves no overt miracles or wonders. And even thinking of this book, the key turning point of this book, I'm sort of going to ruin it for you, primarily because it's anticlimactic, right? The hinge of this book, when everything changes, right? The big God moment that leads to the deliverance of the Jews, right? The book hinges on someone not being able to fall asleep at night, right? Wait, where's the miracles and the wonders? Sort of anticlimactic. But yet, the story of Esther is the story of the deliverance of God's people, just like Exodus. But the story of Esther wants to show you something different than Exodus. Exodus shows you how God can save his people, right? And bring about deliverance through wonders and miracles. But Esther shows you that God can also save his people, deliver his people through everyday, ordinary events. God can save and deliver someone using someone like Moses, but God can also save and deliver using someone like Esther. And if we're honest, Esther isn't even really that great of a Jew, right? But see, that's in part of the point of the story, right? God can deliver and save despite Esther's weaknesses and flaws. Recognize Esther's weaknesses, because it only magnifies God's incredible strength. So as the story of Esther unfolds over the next few weeks, I would challenge you with two things. I would give you two challenges to carry with you as we study through this book of Esther. The first one is to recognize that this story has heroes and heroines, but they are imperfect. The heroes of this story are imperfect. They are imperfect and flawed, sort of like you and me. Treat the characters of this book sort of like an illustration for you to think of, right? Treat the characters of this book sort of like you would seeded grapes, right? Remember when grapes used to have seeds at the store? Sometimes you can find them, but you'd throw a grape in your mouth, and what'd you do? You'd eat the good part, and then you'd spit out the seeds. Some of the things you will see in the book of Esther are exemplary, right? Hey, I want to be like that. Some of the things are very questionable. It's okay to say, maybe I won't emulate that. This book is not a guide to wise cultural engagement or morality. It's okay to reflect on this story and at moments say, in that scenario, I think I would do things differently. This story has heroes and heroines, but they are imperfect. Something to recognize. Let their imperfections reveal to you that God has the power to use and save through imperfect people. The second thing is to be on the lookout. So the first thing kind of starts with recognizing, right? Recognize as you open the book, as you approach these pages, recognize the imperfection of these characters. The second thing is to be on the lookout, okay? Because there actually is a hero to this story who is perfect. But it's the hero who's never mentioned. wait, who is Michael talking about, right? That perfect hero in this story is God. The book is trying to help teach you how to discover God behind the scenes. Man, so often in this book, you're going to hear phrases like, and it just so happened, and happens by chance, ... This book is trying to help you discover how to see God at work behind the scenes, how to better see God as the hero at work, maybe in your own life right now. Because how many times have we said, God, where are you right now? God, I need you to save me right now. Where are you? Exodus shows you what God's deliverance looks like with wonders and miracles. The book of Esther shows you what God's deliverance looks like when it's plain and ordinary. And I would challenge you to be on the lookout for the hero of this story who is perfect. The hero that even in the midst of a secular society, even in the midst of the most secular book in the Bible, even in the midst of secular, flawed people, right? God is this hero who hasn't forgotten or abandoned them. Having recognized this week that Esther is imperfect, in the next week we're going to take a closer look and investigate why God would save someone who is largely separated from her Jewish roots, to say it nicely. Why would God save someone like Esther, these people? Next week, you're going to see that there is something rather special about Esther. There is something that Esther does have, right? And it seems to be enough. Esther simply has faith. Mordecai simply has faith. We often think of these characters as heroes and heroines of the Bible, and they are, but not because they're perfect, right? And not because they are shining examples for us of righteous living. Esther and Mordecai simply have faith. They have faith in a God that seems completely absent from them. And their faith is enough, as we'll see, to transform this book of Esther into a story of salvation and deliverance. Let's pray together. Father, I just pray that you would help us to see the words of this book for what they are. Help us not to carry into this book what we want it to say, what we desire it to say, but what it is that you are saying to us through it. This book sort of doesn't have clean heroes. Those people that we often put up on shining armor on white horses, those heroes, that's not really the book of Esther. It's more like everyday people. And God, there's something beautiful about this book when we really pause and recognize who these characters are. Because it helps us to see, man, you can, if you can do something through Esther or Mordecai with pagan names, maybe you can do something through us. If even their little bit of faith can bring about something like this, what we read through this book, would you help us to have a little bit of faith and see what you do through us? Through the ordinary and plain, day in, day out, would you help us to see how it is you're at work? Would you use this book to train our eyes to see you better? Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.